He's off camera.
I don't do it as good as
All right. So here is Lab 8. I'm just going to review this stuff today, spinal cord and spinal nerves. Lab 8 does continue with the brain and cranial nerves. Now, just to tell you guys, I know I've probably said this, but next Tuesday, you're going to be tested on the brain part of this lab. You're not going to be asked about the cranial nerves, which will actually be good news. So if you want to know what to study for next Tuesday, it's basically on page 12, just that section that says brain and associated structures, stopping before you get to where it says cranial nerves. Okay? That's
Wait,
what.
so we're studying cranial nerves? Or no?
What's that?
No, we're not.
No, you're stopping before. You're not doing the cranial nerves work. Okay? And I'll do you're going to get to see the brain models and stuff in class on Thursday this week, and I'll do a review at the end there, but I'm just giving you a heads up if you wanted to know what the quiz is about. Yeah?
Can you repeat that again? What are we doing testing on?
The section on page 12 where it says brain and associated structures, basically everything on that page except at the bottom where it says cranial nerves. You don't need to know the cranial nerves for next Tuesday. Yeah. You're going to get so much cranial nerve stuff. There'll be lots of cranial nerve questions on the last practical. There's going to be lots of cranial nerve questions on the next lecture exam, so they do raise their ugly head multiple times. Okay. Anyway, so this is the stuff that I'm going to review today. Hopefully you looked at this stuff last week or you looked at it just now. So I'm going to go through the big spinal cord model, showing you all those things up there. Then I'll go through the transverse kind of spinal cord section, show you that. Then I'll go through some microscope slides of the spinal cord. Notice for the microscope slides, you're only responsible for the things that have a little asterisk by them, okay? So, you don't have to identify the anterior white commissure on the microscope slide. You have to be able to see it like on the plastic model, but you don't have to find it on the microscope slide. Then I'll go through the model of the components of a reflex arc, and then we'll just kind of talk about this stuff here. You're not going to have to test the reflexes on each other. You're not going to be graded in like how good your reflex is or something. Like you don't have to get a good partner or whatever. But you do need to know this information that's in these paragraphs. So I'll go through that stuff with you. All right. First things first. This big model. So. A lot of words. And let's see. What? I know. I used to try to struggle. I used to try to struggle to put that underneath the camera, and then I realized it was better to just put it on the ground. All right. Let me move. All right, so this is the entire like spinal cord model that shows you the whole cord. Again, the spinal cord is going to start basically like right up there. What's the beginning of the spinal cord? What's that hole called? The foramen magnum, right? So the foramen magnum is not shown on this model, but it would be roughly like right about there. That would be the start of the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord is going to go all the way down. And then it comes to a point at the end down there. That's called the conus medullaris. And the tip of that conus medullaris is about at the L1, L2 vertebrae level. Okay? So that's the entire spinal cord. Now, hold on a second. Go up a little bit here. Notice it's a little subtle on this model, but I think maybe you can see it. The spinal cord is more or less uniform in width. It does tend to get a little smaller as you go inferiorly, but there are two areas where it gets thicker, right here, and then again right down here. And that's called the cervical enlargement, and then that's called the lumbar enlargement. Those areas are bigger because you have extra nerves coming in from your upper and lower extremities, respectively. Okay. Coming off of the spinal cord, of course, are going to be the spinal nerves. We'll talk about those in a second. Obviously, if you're up in the neck area, these would be the cervical spinal nerves. Then you get into the thoracic spinal nerves, and then as you go down here, you're in the lumbar spinal nerves, and then finally down here, you're into like the sacral, and then lastly the coccygeal spinal nerves. Notice that at the end of the spinal cord, you've got this, so the spinal cord's ending right here, but then you have like these stringy things that look like they're going down here, and those represent spinal nerves that are attached to the lower parts of the spinal cord, but in order for them to exit from their corresponding vertebrae, they have to descend first and then exit. And because of that, it creates this pattern that's known as the cauda equina, or the horse's tail, right? So this represents spinal nerves attached to the lower parts of the spinal cord that have to go descend before they're able to then exit through their various intervertebral foramen. If you look at that up close, okay, here it is up close. You can see the spinal nerves going down. Now, in the very middle of that cauda equina, though, is this thing here that's actually attached to the tip of the conus medullaris, and that's the filum terminale, the thing that's in the middle. Now, that's not a spinal nerve. The filum terminale is an extension of the pia mater that kind of acts like an anchor or a rope to hold the spinal cord in place. So that's going to connect the tip of the conus medullaris all the way down, if you trace it, to the tip of the coccyx, which is down, down here. So that thing in the center is the filum terminale. All the rest of it are spinal nerves, but together they form this thing that looks like a horse's tail that they call the cauda equina. Keep in mind that most of your spinal nerves, as soon as they exit the between the intervertebral foramen, they immediately start giving off branches, and they usually call those branches rami. I'll show you some of the rami on the other model in a second, but remember that the biggest rami is something called the anterior ramus, and usually the anterior ramus will come out and it will connect with other anterior rami either above or below it and form these things called plexuses. Sorry, I better check this. All right. The only exception to that, anyone remember the area where you don't have a plexus?
C1.
No? I'll give you a choice. Cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, or coccygeal. It's thoracic. Thoracic is the only spot where you don't form plexuses. I'll show you that in a second. So if you're looking up here in the neck area, these would be the cervical spinal nerves, and you can see how some of them are kind of interconnecting with each other, like there and there. You can see like this little guy interconnecting there, or these two guys connecting up there. That would be the cervical plexus then. You don't need to know it for lab purposes, but this guy coming down here is actually that phrenic nerve, which is the nerve that goes to your diaphragm. It's coming off of the cervical plexus. Okay? Next, you have probably what's the most obvious plexus or biggest plexus to see, and that's this guy here, and that's the brachial plexus. It's also present on this side, but they kind of had some muscles in the way, so it's a little harder to see. The brachial plexus is in charge of organizing the nerves that are going to go to your upper extremities. Okay. Then you go into the thoracic area, and notice in the thoracic area, there's no plexuses. They just go out. There's a straight shot. They just go out. They don't interconnect with each other, so you get a break. There's no plexuses in the thoracic area. Then as you go down lower, though, they start interconnecting again. So in this area, this would be the lumbar plexus. And then as you go down further, these interconnections in here would be the sacral plexus. And then this little tiny thing down here would be the coccygeal plexus. Okay? Plexuses are just ways of kind of organizing the nerves before you send them to different areas of the body. That's all they really are. Okay? I think that's all I wanted to say on this model. Yeah. So now let me go over to the spinal cord section model. And I'm gonna kind of do this by working my way from outside to in. Cover this. Hold on. Okay, so obviously this thing here that's in white, what's the thing that's in white here? That's the vertebrae, right? That's the bone, right? Anyone? I kind of floored the class this morning with this question. It was crickets, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Anyone know what kind of vertebrae this is? Cervical, good. All right. There was an uncomfortable like 15-second pause this morning when I asked that question. Remember the bifid kind of spinous process? Also, you got the central opening here, the vertebral foramen, but there's also openings here and there for those blood vessels in the transverse foramen, so that should tell you it's cervical. You don't need to know that. I was just curious whether you remembered anything from like 2 weeks ago or whatever. So let me work my way from outside to in. You got the bone, we already know that. This thing that's in gray here, that's essentially the periosteum of the bone. Okay, I don't think it's listed in your lab guide, you don't have to know it, but in case you were wondering, what is that gray thing? It's the covering of the vertebrae, okay? Now, as you go below that, in this area here where it's yellow, that's a lot of fat that's in there. These are supposed to be some blood vessels that are running through it. That's going to be the epidural space, okay? And it's called that because this layer here is the dura mater. So the space that's kind of covering it up here would be the epidural space, and it's got a lot of fat in it. And you can trace it around over here as well. That's all considered epidural space. As I said, that layer then is the dura mater. Directly attached to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater. You can see the little line between the two of them. I don't think that's listed in your lab guide, but that technically would be the subdural space, okay? It's more of a potential space. Like you can, during a trauma situation, it can fill up with blood and give you like a subdural hematoma and whatnot. But for the most part, you really can't see it. The next layer is the arachnoid mater. So, sorry, let's see focus. This would be the arachnoid mater right there. And then this space that's beneath the arachnoid mater, that's the subarachnoid space. And you can see it goes all the way around that subarachnoid space. And that's the space that's going to be filled up with cerebral spinal fluid. And if this was a real like specimen, there would actually be little fibers running through the subarachnoid space that would make it kind of look like a spider web. And that's how, that's how it got called the arachnoid layer and all that other stuff, right? So that's the subarachnoid space in there. And then this layer that's directly attached to the spinal cord, that would be the pia mater. Okay? See that going around there. Other stuff to kind of work, again, try to work my way from outside to in. Notice that you have the nerve roots present on here, as well as the spinal nerves. So this would be the dorsal root coming in there. And if you trace the dorsal root back, you'll see that you actually have this bulging area that represents the dorsal root ganglion right there. Okay. This down here, so you can see it on this side, although they didn't cut the nerve open here, so you can't really see it, but it's inside there, right? These guys coming off here or down there, those are going to be the ventral roots. And notice if you trace them out, there's no kind of bulge on them, right? You don't need to know it for lab purposes, but remember for lecture purposes, the dorsal root will always have sensory neurons in it. The ventral root will have motor neurons in it. Okay? If you keep tracing the roots out, eventually when they come together, like out here, you would refer to this as the spinal nerve. And then the spinal nerve almost immediately starts giving off branches. This branch that's going towards the back, that would be the posterior ramus. This little branch that's coming over here and connecting up with this weird thing, that's one of the rami communicantes, which is part of your autonomic nervous system. Now, in lecture, I did tell you about something called the meningeal branch. They don't even show the meningeal branch on this model. You don't have to worry about that for like lab purposes. But this guy that continues on, this would technically be the anterior ramus. This is going to be the biggest branch. This is the branch that forms the plexuses, okay? So you can see that there. Now, let me go back to this and actually show you the spinal cord itself, and the parts you need to know there. So always get your bearings first, I would say by looking at the grooves. The wider, more obvious groove is going to be the anterior median fissure. And so that's going to tell you that this part is anterior. And then the one that's usually a little bit more narrow and less obvious, that's the posterior median sulcus, and that'll tell you where posterior is. You gotta get your anterior and posterior down first, or else you're gonna mess up the names of the gray and the white matter, okay? So it's really important to know that. Again, everything I've shown you so far, I've always showed you, you know, with anterior being down and posterior being up, but you know, there's no rule that says I can't show you this. Oh my God, what happened, right? And you know, so you should know to be able to like look for that, right? Anyway, other stuff you can tell, this little opening in the middle, that's the central canal. Right in front of the central canal, in brown there, that would be the gray commissure. And then in front of that, kind of in white that you see there, that would be the anterior white commissure right in front. Those are spots where, remember, in the gray commissure, in the gray commissure, unmyelinated axons cross sides. In the anterior white commissure, myelinated axons cross sides. If I back this up, I can start asking about some of the different areas. So when you look at the gray matter, remember they name these things as horns. So this down here would be the anterior gray horn, or over there if you prefer. This thing coming off to the side here or over there would be the lateral gray horn, and then this part back here or here would be the posterior gray horn. For the white matter, it follows a similar pattern. This area down here or over here, that would be the anterior white columns. I think in your textbook they're using the word funiculus, like anterior white funiculus. You could use either name, I don't really care. It's more important to get the anterior white part in than to get the funiculus or column in. So that's the anterior white column, anterior white column. These over here would be the lateral white columns, there and there. And then back here, this whole area back here is going to be the posterior white columns. All right, I think that's all I had to say on this model. Now, let me show you the microscope slides of the spinal cord. I probably got logged out, of course. Let's see here. All right. Here's like a cross section of the spinal cord. Again, get your bearings first. Make sure you know your anterior from your posterior. This one is really obvious, right? They made this one has a huge anterior median fissure, and then this fairly narrow posterior median fissure that you see back there. So you know that down here is anterior once again, and then up at the top would be posterior. Then you can start naming the other parts. It's a little hard to see, but obviously in the middle you'd have the central canal. It probably got compressed, so you're not seeing it really well. In terms of the gray matter, these would be the posterior gray horns. These would be the lateral gray horns, and then these would be the anterior gray horns. In terms of the white matter, this would be the anterior white columns, lateral white columns, and then posterior white columns back there. Okay. Let's do another one. Here's another one. It's a little bit hard. I mean, they're sort of subtle, but this is the anterior median fissure again. It's a little bit more wide and open than this guy. This is the posterior median sulcus. All right. Back there would be the posterior gray horns. Anterior gray horns would be there and there. This is going to be the lateral gray horn, and then for the white matter, this would be the anterior white columns, lateral white columns. And then back there would be the posterior white columns. Okay. Once again, the central canal kind of got compressed, so you really can't see it. Here's a really good one. Number one, it has a good central canal. So central canal is nice and wide open. The darker line, it's a little heavier, is the anterior median fissure. The more faint line is the posterior median sulcus. This one's kind of nice because even if you don't see the difference there, they included the nerve roots on here, and if you follow them, here's the dorsal root, and if you follow it, this big area bulging there, that would be the dorsal root ganglia, okay? or you can start to see it over on this side. So that could also be a way to kind of tell you that that's posterior back there, versus this guy is the ventral root. And you can see that there's really no like ganglion there, so that would tip you off to that. All the other stuff is basically the same. Now remember, the lateral gray horn is only present in some of the lower cervical and thoracic areas, so you won't necessarily see a lateral gray horn every place, and you don't really see it on this one, but you do see the anterior gray horn, and you do see the posterior gray horn. Once again, this would be the anterior white columns, lateral white columns, and then the posterior white columns. It's not, I mean, spinal cord slides are really not that bad. It's just a question of don't mess up your anterior from your posterior, and you should get everything right. Let's see, did I have another one? No. All right, on to the reflex model.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Can I use column in horn education?
And what? Horn?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you probably can. I'm not going to really probably split hairs about it. She asked if you use column and horn interchangeably. I've seen it happen. Yeah, it's more important that you get the first two words down, the anterior versus posterior, and then the white versus gray. Yeah. All right, so here is the reflex arc model. There's 5 parts to the reflex arc to be aware of. So let me go through the 5 parts. The first part of the reflex arc would be the sensory receptors. On this particular model, like these little things that are in green here, those might be something like a Meissner's corpuscle, for example, or even like these things that don't have any green on them. Those would be like free nerve endings. Those are all examples of receptors. So the receptor is the first part of the reflex arc. The second part is the sensory neuron itself, which is shown in yellow. What was the other name for sensory neurons? You don't remember? Not ascending, but afferent neurons. That's the other name for them. Okay. I mean, you're right that sensory neurons, when you're in the spinal cord, are usually ascending, but when you're talking about out in the peripheral nervous system, like you are here, you can call a sensory neuron afferent, you can call a motor neuron efferent. So whatever name you want to use, I don't really care. I just make sure you're aware of them. So that's number 2. That's the second part of the reflex arc. It's the sensory neuron. Notice that it's using the dorsal root to come in. Notice that it's got a unipolar shape to it, and that its cell body is sitting in that dorsal root ganglion. That's what's creating the ganglion. Picture a whole bunch of sensory neurons that are right next to this one, and all of their cell bodies would basically be sitting right here. Okay. So that's the second part. It goes into the spinal cord. Then in here, whatever's going on in the spinal cord in this area, that would be the third part, the control center or the integrating center, whatever you want to call it. On this particular model, they put an interneuron in here in green. But remember, not all reflexes will have interneurons. Sometimes you'll have the sensory neuron directly synapsing with it. So whether you have an interneuron or not, though, this would be the integrating center or the control center. That's the third part. Fourth part is the motor neuron. That's this guy in orange coming out here. Now notice the motor neuron is going to have its cell body in the anterior gray horn, and then it's going to use the ventral root to go out, and there's no ganglion on the ventral root. So that's the fourth part. And then the last part, the fifth part of the reflex arc, is the effector. In a somatic reflex like they're trying to show you here, the effector is always going to be what? Skeletal muscle. If it's an autonomic reflex, it'll be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands, right? So those are that's the model of the reflex arc. And last but not least are the reflexes that you should know. So make sure you know all the information in both of these 2 paragraphs, and this one continues on the next page. So for the patellar reflex, you should know that when you're testing it, you're basically hitting someone's patellar tendon, or technically it would be called the patellar ligament at that point. You could use the term patellar ligament, patellar tendon. You could even call it the quad tendon if you wanted to. I'm not gonna make, but the point is, you're not actually hitting the bone, right? You're not hitting the patella, you're hitting just inferior to it where that's kind of soft. If you do that, then that tendon should pull on the entire quad muscle, and for a split second, it'll make the quad a little too long. It'll stretch it and make it a little too long. The quad doesn't like being long like that, so a reflex signal will be sent right back out to the quad to make it contract to try to get it back to its optimal starting length. When, of course, when the quad contracts, the normal response would be to basically kick, or, you know, you could phrase it knee extension, right? That's the normal response that you should see. If you don't see a response at all, it could suggest that you have damage to the nerves that are supplying the quad muscle, or it might be damage within the L2, L3, or L4 part of the spinal cord. Okay, so make sure you know all that. For the Achilles reflex, it's the same type of reflex. It's a stretch reflex, but here you're testing the stretch on the gastrocnemius muscle, right? And you know, you sit the person down, and you basically use the reflex hammer to hit the Achilles tendon. And when you do that for a split second, that will stretch the gastrocnemius muscle, which will then send a motor signal out to the gastroc, causing it to contract. And when that happens, you should see like your foot just kind of flick down real quick and basically do plantar flexion, right? That's the normal response. If you don't see that response, that could indicate problems with the nerves going to the gastrocnemius, or maybe some damage within the S1 part of the spinal cord. Okay. Any questions about any of that stuff from the spinal cord lab? Everyone pretty good with that? Okay, so don't forget that information. There's no quiz about it, but it'll definitely come up on your last lab practical. Okay? All right, now I have to shift gears and talk about, move on to a new chapter, the brain chapter.
Should I end it or should I?
End it.
Yeah.
We should just do separate videos.